In the northern latitudes, the dawn comes early. Even as the bombers were turning away from the city, the first rays of light were coming up in the east. In the stillness of the morning, great pillars of black smoke towered over the districts of Pankow, Weissensee, and Lichtenberg. On the low clouds, it was difficult to separate the soft glow of daylight from the reflections of the fires that blazed in bomb-battered Berlin. As the smoke drifted slowly across the ruins, Germany's most bombed city stood out in stark, macabre splendour. It was blackened by soot, pockmarked by thousands of craters, and laced with the twisted girders of ruined buildings. Whole blocks of apartment houses were gone, and in the very heart of the capital, entire neighbourhoods had vanished. In these wastelands, what had once been broad roads and streets were now pitted trails that snaked through mountains of rubble. Everywhere, covering acre after acre, gutted, windowless, roofless buildings gaped up at the sky. In the aftermath of the raid, a fine residue of soot and ash rained down, powdering the wreckage, and in the great canyons of smashed brick and tortured steel, nothing moved but the eddying dust. It swirled along the broad expanse of the Unter den Linden, the famous trees bare now, the leaf buds seared on the branches. Few of the banks, libraries, and elegant shops lining the renowned boulevard were undamaged. But at the western end of the avenue, Berlin's most famous landmark, the 8-story-high Brandenburg Gate, though gashed and chipped, still straddled the Via Triumphalis on its 12 massive Doric columns. On the nearby Wilhelmstrasse, lined by government buildings and former palaces, shards of glass from thousands of windows glittered in the debris. At number 73, the beautiful little palace that had been the official residence of German presidents in the days before the Third Reich had been gutted by a raging fire. Once it had been described as a miniature Versailles. Now sea nymphs from the ornate fountain in the forecourt lay shattered against the colonnaded front entrance, and along the roofline, chipped and gouged by flying fragments, the twin statues of Rhine maidens leaned headless over the littered courtyard. A block away, number 77 was scarred but intact. Piles of rubble lay all around the 3-story L-shaped building. Its yellowish-brown exterior was scabrous, and the garish golden eagles above each entrance, garlanded with swastikas in their claws, were pitted and deeply scored. Jutting out above was the imposing balcony from which the world had been harangued with many a frenzied speech. The Reichskanzlei, Chancellery of Adolf Hitler, still remained. At the top of the battered Kurfürstendamm, Berlin's Fifth Avenue, bulked the deformed skeleton of the once fashionable Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. The hands on the charred clock face were stopped at exactly 7:30. They had been that way since 1943, when bombs wiped out 1,000 acres of the city on a single November evening. 100 yards away was the jungle of wreckage that had been the internationally famed Berlin Zoo. The aquarium was completely destroyed. The reptile, hippopotamus, kangaroo, tiger, and elephant houses, along with scores of other buildings, were severely damaged. The surrounding Tiergarten, the renowned 630-acre park, was a no-man's land of room-sized craters, rubble-filled lakes, and partly demolished embassy buildings. Once the park had been a natural forest of luxuriant trees. Now most of them were burned and ugly stumps. In the northeast corner of the Tiergarten stood Berlin's most spectacular ruin, destroyed not by Allied bombs but by German politics. The huge Reichstag, seat of parliament, had been deliberately set ablaze by the Nazis in 1933, and the fire had been blamed on the communists, thus providing Hitler with an excuse to seize full dictatorial power. On the crumbling portico above its 6-columned entrance, overlooking the sea of wreckage that almost engulfed the building, were the chiselled, blackened words, Dem deutschen Volke, to the German people. A complex of statuary had once stood before the Reichstag. All had been destroyed except one piece, a 200-foot-high dark red granite and bronze column on a massive colonnaded base. After the 1933 burning, Hitler had ordered it moved. Now it stood a mile away on the Charlottenburger Chaussee, close to the centre of the east-west axis, the series of linked highways running across the city roughly from the River Havel on the west to the end of the Unter den Linden on the east. As the sun rose on this March morning, its rays caught the golden figure at the top of the column, a winged statue bearing a laurel wreath in one hand, a standard adorned with the Iron Cross in the other. Rising up out of the wasteland, untouched by the bombing, was Berlin's slender, graceful memorial, the Victory Column. Across the tormented city, sirens began wailing the all clear. The 314th Allied raid on Berlin was over. In the first years of the war, the attacks had been sporadic, but now the capital was under almost continuous bombardment. The Americans bombed by day, the RAF by night. The statistics of destruction had increased almost hourly. By now they were staggering. Explosives had laid waste more than 10 square miles of built-up districts, 10 times the area destroyed in London by the Luftwaffe. 3 billion cubic feet of debris lay in the streets, enough rubble for a mountain more than 1,000 feet high. Almost half of Berlin's 1,562,000 dwellings had sustained some kind of damage, and every third house was either completely destroyed or uninhabitable. Casualties were so high that a true accounting would never be possible, but at least 52,000 were dead, and twice that number seriously injured, 5 times the number killed and seriously injured in the bombing of London. Berlin had become a second Carthage, and the final agony was still to come. In this wilderness of devastation, it was remarkable that people could survive at all. But life went on with a kind of lunatic normality amid the ruins. 12,000 policemen were still on duty. Postmen delivered the mail, newspapers came out daily, telephone and telegraphic services continued. Garbage was collected. Some cinemas, theatres, and even a part of the wrecked zoo were open. The Berlin Philharmonic was finishing its season. Department stores ran special sales. Food and bakery shops opened each morning, and laundries, dry cleaning establishments, and beauty salons did a brisk business. The underground and elevated railways functioned. The few fashionable bars and restaurants still intact drew capacity crowds. And on almost every street, the strident calls of Berlin's famous flower vendors echoed as in the days of peace. Perhaps most remarkable, more than 65% of Berlin's great factories were in some kind of working condition. Almost 600,000 people had jobs, but getting to them now was a major problem. It often took hours. Traffic was clogged, there were detours, slowdowns and breakdowns. As a consequence, Berliners had taken to rising early. Everyone wanted to get to work on time because the Americans, early risers themselves, were often at work over the city by 9 a.m. On this bright morning in the city's sprawling 20 districts, Berliners came forth like Neolithic cave dwellers. They emerged from the bowels of subways, from shelters beneath public buildings, from the cellars and basements of their shattered homes. Whatever their hopes or fears, whatever their loyalties or political beliefs, this much Berliners had in common. Those who had survived another night were determined to live another day. The same could be said for the nation itself. In this 6th year of World War II, Hitler's Germany was fighting desperately for survival. The Reich that was to last a millennium had been invaded from west and east. The Anglo-American forces were sweeping down on the great river Rhine, had breached it at Remagen, and were racing for Berlin. They were only 300 miles to the west. On the eastern banks of the Oder, a far more urgent and infinitely more fearful threat had materialized. There stood the Russian armies, less than 50 miles away. It was Wednesday, March 21st, 1945, the first day of spring. On radios all over the city this morning, Berliners heard the latest hit tune. This will be a spring without end. To the dangers that threatened them, Berliners reacted each in their own way. Some stubbornly disregarded the peril, hoping it would go away. Some courted it. Others reacted with anger or fear, and some, with the grim logic of those whose backs are to the wall, prepared bravely to meet their fate head-on. In the southwestern district of Zehlendorf, milkman Richard Poganowska was, as usual, up with the dawn. In years past, his daily routine had often seemed monotonous. Now he was grateful for it. He worked for the 300-year-old Domine Dahlem farm in Zehlendorf's fashionable suburb of Dahlem, only a few miles from the centre of the huge capital. In any other city, the dairy's location would have been considered an oddity, but not in Berlin. 1/5 of the city's total area lay in parks and woodlands, along lakes, canals and streams. Still, Pogonowska, like many other Domine employees, wished the farm were somewhere else, far outside the city, away from the danger and the constant bombing. Pogonowska, his wife Lisbeth, and their 3 children had spent the night once again in the cellar of the main building on the Königin Luise Strasse. Sleep had been almost impossible because of the hammering of anti-aircraft guns and the bursting of bombs. Like everyone else in Berlin, the big 39-year-old milkman was constantly tired these days. He had no idea where bombs had dropped during the night, but he knew none had fallen near the Domane's big cow barns. The precious milk herd was safe. Nothing seemed to bother those 200 cows. Amid the explosion of bombs and the thunder of anti-aircraft fire, they stood patiently, placidly chewing their cuds, and in some miraculous way they continued to produce milk. It never ceased to amaze Pogonowska. Sleepily he loaded the ancient brown milk wagon and its trailer, hitched up his 2 horses, the fox-coloured Lisa and Hans, and, with his grey Spitz dog Poldy on the seat beside him, set out on his rounds. Rattling across the courtyard cobblestones, he turned right on Pacelli Alley and headed north in the direction of Schmargendorf. It was 6 a.m. It would be 9 at night before he finished. Worn out, aching for sleep, Pogonowska still had not lost his cheerfully gruff manner. He had become a kind of morale builder for his 1,200 customers. His route lay on the fringes of 3 major districts, Zehlendorf, Schöneberg and Wilmersdorf. All 3 had been badly bombed. Schöneberg and Wilmersdorf, lying closest to the centre of the city, were almost obliterated. In Wilmersdorf alone, more than 36,000 dwellings were destroyed, and almost half of the 340,000 people in the 2 districts had been left homeless. Under the circumstances, a cheerful face was a rare and welcome sight. Even at this early hour, Pogonowska found people waiting for him at each intersection. There were queues everywhere these days, for the butcher, the baker, even for water when the mains were hit. Despite the lines of customers, Pogonowska rang a large cowbell announcing his arrival. He had begun the practice early in the year when the increase in daylight raids made it impossible for him to deliver door to door. To his customers, the bell, like Pogonowska himself, had become something of a symbol. This morning was no different. Pogonowska greeted his customers and doled out their rationed quantities of milk and dairy products. He had been acquainted with some of these people for nearly a decade, and they knew he could be counted on for a little extra now and then. By juggling the ration cards, Pogonowska could usually produce a little more milk or cream for special occasions, like christenings or weddings. To be sure, it was illegal and therefore risky, but all Berliners had to face risks these days. More and more, Pogonowska's customers seemed tired, tense, and preoccupied. Few people talked about the war anymore. Nobody knew what was going on, and nobody could have done anything about it in any case. Besides, there were enough armchair generals. Pogonowska did not invite discussions of the news. By submerging himself in his 15-hour daily routine and refusing to think about the war, he, like thousands of other Berliners, had almost immunized himself against it. Each day now, Pogonowska watched for certain signs that helped keep him from losing heart. For one thing, the roads were still open. There were no roadblocks or tank traps on the main streets, no artillery pieces or dug-in tanks, no soldiers manning key positions. There was nothing to indicate that the authorities feared a Russian attack, or that Berlin was threatened with siege. There was one other small but significant clue. Every morning, as Pogonowska drove through the sub-district of Friedenau, where some of his more prominent customers lived, he glanced at the home of a well-known Nazi, an important official in the Berlin postal department. Through the open living-room windows he could see the big portrait in its massive frame. The garish painting of Adolf Hitler, features boldly arrogant, was still there. Pogonowska knew the ways of the Third Reich's bureaucrats. If the situation were really critical, that shrine to the Führer would have disappeared by now. He clucked softly to the horses and continued on his route. Despite everything, he could see no real reason to be unduly alarmed. No part of the city had been completely spared from the bombing, but Spandau, Berlin's second largest and most western district, had escaped the kind of attack everyone feared most: saturation bombing. Night after night, the inhabitants expected the blow. They were amazed that it had not come, for Spandau was the centre of Berlin's vast armament industry. In contrast to districts in the very heart of the city that had suffered 50 to 75% destruction, Spandau had lost only 10% of its buildings. Although this meant that more than 1,000 houses were either destroyed or unusable, by the standards of raid-toughened Berliners, that was a mere flea-bite. A caustic remark was current in the bomb-blackened wastelands of the central districts. Die Spandauer Zwerge kommen zuletzt in die Sarge. The little Spandauites are last to reach their coffins. On Spandau's westernmost fringe, in the quiet pastoral sub-district of Staaken, Robert and Ingeborg Kolb were more than grateful to live in a kind of backwater. The only bombs that had fallen even close were those that missed the nearby airfield, and the damage was slight. Their two-story orange and brown stucco home, with its glass-enclosed veranda and its surrounding lawn and garden, remained unharmed. Life went on almost normally, except that Robert, the 54-year-old technical director of a printing plant, was finding the daily trip to his job in the city's centre increasingly arduous. It meant running the gamut of the daylight raids. It was a constant worry to Ingeborg. This evening, the Kolbs planned, as usual, to listen to the German-language broadcasts of the BBC, although it was a practice long forbidden. Step by step, they had followed the Allied advances from east and west. Now the Red Army was only a bus ride from the city's eastern outskirts. Yet, lulled by the rural atmosphere of their surroundings, they found the imminent threat to the city unthinkable, the war remote and unreal. Robert Kolb was convinced they were quite safe, and Ingeborg was convinced that Robert was always right. After all, he was a veteran of World War I. The war, Robert had assured her, will pass us by. Quite certain that no matter what happened they would not be involved, the Kolbs calmly looked to the future. Now that spring was here, Robert was trying to decide where to hang the hammocks in the garden. Ingeborg had chores of her own to do. She planned to plant spinach, parsley, lettuce, and early potatoes. There was one major problem. Should she sow the early potatoes in the first part of April, or wait until the more settled spring days of May? At his headquarters in a grey stucco three-storey house on the outskirts of Landsberg, 25 miles from the Oder, Marshal of the Soviet Union Georgy K. Zhukov sat at his desk pondering some plans of his own. On one wall, a large map of Berlin showed in detail Zhukov's proposed offensive to capture the city. On his desk were 3 field phones. One was for general use, another linked him to his colleagues, Marshals Konstantin Rokossovsky and Ivan Stepanovich Koniev, commanders of the huge army groups on his northern and southern flanks. The third phone was a direct line to Moscow and the Supreme Commander, Joseph Stalin. The barrel-chested 49-year-old commander of the First Belarusian Front spoke to Stalin each night at 11, reporting the day's advances. Now, Zhukov wondered how soon Stalin would give the command to take Berlin. He hoped he still had some time. At a pinch, Zhukov thought he could take the city immediately, but he was not quite ready. Tentatively, he had planned the attack for around the end of April. With luck, he thought he could reach Berlin and reduce all resistance within 10 or 12 days. The Germans would contest him for every inch, that he expected. Probably they would fight hardest on the western edge of the city. There, as far as he could see, lay the only clear-cut escape route for the German defenders, but he planned to hit them from both sides as they tried to get out. By the first week of May, he anticipated wholesale slaughter in the district of Spandau. In his second-floor Wilmersdorf apartment, Karl Johann Weiberg pushed open the shuttered French windows of his living room, stepped out onto the little balcony and took stock of the weather. With him were his constant companions, Uncle Otto and Aunt Effie, two waddling, liver-coloured dachshunds. They looked up at him expectantly, waiting for their morning walk. Walking was about all Weiberg did to pass the time these days. Everyone in the neighbourhood liked the 49-year-old Swedish businessman. They considered him a good Berliner first, a Swede second. He had not left the city like so many other foreigners when the bombing began. Moreover, although Weiberg never complained about his troubles, his neighbours knew that he had lost almost everything. His wife had died in 1939. His glue factories had been bombed out of business. After 30 years as a small businessman in Berlin, he had little left now but his dogs and the apartment. In the opinion of some of his neighbours, he was a better man than many a true German. Weiberg looked down at Uncle Otto and Aunt Effie. "Time to go out," he said. He closed the windows and walked across the living room to the little foyer. He put on his beautifully tailored Chesterfield and settled his carefully brushed Homburg on his head. Opening the drawer of a polished mahogany hall table, he took out a pair of suede gloves and for a moment stood looking at a framed lithograph lying inside the drawer. The print, sketched in flamboyant colours, showed a fully armoured knight mounted on a rampaging white stallion. Attached to the knight's lance was a streaming banner. Through the helmet's open visor, the knight gazed fiercely out. A lock of hair fell over his forehead. He had piercing eyes and a small black moustache. Across the waving banner were the words, "Der Bannertrager," the standard bearer. Weiberg slowly closed the drawer. He kept the lithograph hidden because the derisive lampoon of Hitler was banned throughout Germany. But Weiberg did not want to get rid of it. The caricature was too amusing to throw away. Snapping leashes on the dogs, he locked the front door carefully behind him and went down the 2 flights of stairs and into the rubble of the street. Near the apartment house, he doffed his hat to some neighbours and, with the dogs leading, made his way down the street, stepping carefully around the potholes. He wondered where Der Bannertrager was now that the end seemed near. In Munich? At his eagle's nest in the mountains at Berchtesgaden? Or here, in Berlin? No one seemed to know, although that was not surprising. Hitler's whereabouts was always a big secret. This morning Weiberg decided to drop in at his favourite bar, Harry Ross's at 7 Nestorstrasse, one of the few left open in the district. It had a varied clientele, Nazi bigwigs, German officers, and a smattering of businessmen. There was always good conversation, and one could catch up on the latest news, where last night's bombs had fallen, which factories had been hit, how Berlin was standing up under it all. Weiberg liked meeting his old friends in this convivial atmosphere, and he was interested in just about every aspect of the war, especially the effects of the bombings and the morale of the German people. In particular, he wanted to know where Hitler was. As he crossed the street, he once again tipped his hat to an old acquaintance. Despite all the questions that crowded his mind, Weiberg knew a few things that would have surprised his neighbours. For this Swede, who was more German than the Germans, was also a member of America's top-secret Office of Strategic Services. He was an Allied spy. In his ground-floor apartment in Kreuzberg, Dr. Arthur Lechscheidt, evangelical pastor of the Melanchthon Church, was beset by grief and despair. His twin-spired Gothic church was destroyed, and his flock dissipated. Through the windows he could see the remains of his church. A few weeks before, it had received a direct hit, and minutes later, incendiaries had set it ablaze. The sorrow he felt each time he looked at it had not yet abated. At the height of the raid, oblivious of his own safety, Pastor Lechscheidt had rushed into the blazing church. The back of the edifice and its magnificent organ were still intact. Running swiftly up the narrow steps to the organ loft, Lechscheidt had but one thought: to bid farewell to his beloved organ and to the church. Singing softly to himself, eyes filled with tears, Dr. Lechscheidt played his farewell. As bombs burst all over Kreuzberg, incredulous patients in the nearby urban hospital and people sheltering in adjacent cellars heard the Melanchthon organ pealing out the ancient hymn, "From deepest need I cry to thee." Now he was saying a different kind of goodbye. On his desk was the draft of a round-robin letter he would send to those many parishioners who had left the city or were in the armed forces. Even though fighting in the east and west is keeping us in tension, he wrote, the German capital is constantly the centre of air raids. You can imagine, dear friends, that death is reaping a rich harvest. Coffins have become a scarcity. A woman told me that she had offered 20 pounds of honey for one in which to lay her deceased husband. Dr. Lechscheit was also angered. We ministers are not always called to burials of air raid victims, he wrote. Often the party takes over the funerals without a minister, without God's word. And again throughout his letter, he referred to the devastation of the city. You cannot imagine what Berlin looks like now. The loveliest buildings have crumbled into ruins. Often we have no gas, light, or water. God keep us from a famine. Terrific prices are asked for black market commodities. And he ended on a note of bitter pessimism. This is probably the last letter for a long time. Perhaps we shall soon be cut off from all communication. Shall we see each other again? It all rests in God's hands. Cycling purposefully through the littered streets of Dahlem, another clergyman, Father Bernhard Happich, had decided to take matters into his own hands. A delicate problem had worried him for weeks. Night after night he had prayed for guidance and meditated on the course he should take. Now he had reached a decision. The services of all clergymen were in great demand, but this was particularly true of Father Happich. The 55-year-old priest, who carried the words Jesuit not fit for military service stamped across his identity card, a Nazi imprint like that reserved for Jews and other dangerous undesirables, was also a highly skilled doctor of medicine. Among his many other duties, he was the Father Provincial of Haus Dahlem, the orphanage, maternity hospital, and foundling home run by the Mission Sisters of the Sacred Heart. It was Mother Superior Cunegundes and her flock who had brought about his problem and his decision. Father Happich had no illusions about the Nazis or how the war must surely end. He had long ago decided that Hitler and his brutal new order were destined for disaster. Now the crisis was fast approaching. Berlin was trapped, the tarnished chalice in the conqueror's eye. What would happen to Haus Dahlem and its good but less than worldly sisters? His face serious, Father Happich pulled up outside the home. The building had suffered only superficial damage, and the sisters were convinced that their prayers were being heard. Father Happich did not disagree with them, but being a practical man, he thought that luck and bad marksmanship might have had something to do with it. As he passed through the entrance hall, he looked up at the great statue, garbed in blue and gold, sword held high, St. Michael, God's fighting knight against all evil. The sisters' faith in St. Michael was well founded, but just the same, Father Happich was glad he had made his decision. Like everyone else, he had heard from refugees who had fled before the advancing Russians of the horrors that had taken place in eastern Germany. Many of the accounts were exaggerated, he was sure, but some he knew to be true. Father Happich had decided to warn the sisters. Now he had to choose the right moment to tell them, and above all, he had to find the right words. Father Happich worried about that. How do you tell 60 nuns and lay sisters that they are in danger of being raped? The fear of sexual attack lay over the city like a pall, for Berlin, after nearly 6 years of war, was now primarily a city of women. At the beginning, in 1939, there were 4,321,000 inhabitants of the capital. But huge war casualties, the call-up of both men and women, and the voluntary evacuation of 1 million citizens to the safer countryside in 1943–44 had cut that figure by more than one-third. By now, the only males left in any appreciable number were children under 18 and men over 60. The 18 to 30 male age group totalled barely 100,000, and most of them were exempt from military service or wounded. In January 1945, the city's population had been estimated at 2,900,000, but now, in mid-March, that figure was certainly too high. After 85 raids in less than 11 weeks, and with the threat of siege hanging over the city, thousands more had fled. Military authorities estimated that Berlin's civil population was now about 2,700,000, of whom more than 2 million were women, and even that was only an informed guess. Complicating efforts to obtain a true population figure was the vast exodus of refugees from the Soviet-occupied eastern provinces. Some put the refugee figure as high as 500,000. Uprooted, carrying their belongings on their backs, or in horse-drawn wagons or pushcarts, often driving farm animals before them, fleeing civilians had clogged the roads into Berlin for months. Most did not remain in the city but continued west. But in their wake they left a repository of nightmarish stories. These accounts of their experiences had spread like an epidemic through Berlin, infecting many citizens with terror. The refugees told of a vengeful, violent, and rapacious conqueror. People who had trekked from as far away as Poland, or from the captured parts of East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, gave bitter testimony of an enemy who offered no quarter. In fact, the refugees declared, Russian propaganda was urging the Red Army to spare no one. They told of a manifesto, said to have been written by the Soviet Union's top propagandist, Ilya Ehrenburg, which was both broadcast and distributed in leaflet form to the Red troops. "Kill! Kill!" went the manifesto. "In the German race there is nothing but evil. Follow the precepts of Comrade Stalin. Stamp out the fascist beast once and for all in its lair. Use force and break the racial pride of these Germanic women. Take them as your lawful booty. Kill! As you storm onward, kill, you gallant soldiers of the Red Army." The refugees reported that advancing frontline troops were well disciplined and well behaved, but that the secondary units that followed were a disorganized rabble. In wild, drunken orgies, these Red Army men had murdered, looted, and raped. Many Russian commanders, the refugees claimed, appeared to condone the actions of their men. At least they made no effort to stop them. From peasants to gentry, the accounts were the same, and everywhere in the flood of refugees there were women who told chilling stories of brutal assault, of being forced at gunpoint to strip and then submit to repeated rapings. How much was fantasy, how much fact? Berliners were not sure. Those who knew of the atrocities and mass murders committed by German SS troops in Russia, and there were thousands who knew, feared that the stories were true. Those who were aware of what was happening to the Jews in concentration camps, a new and horrible aspect of National Socialism of which the free world was yet to learn, believed the refugees too. These more knowledgeable Berliners could well believe that the oppressor was becoming the oppressed, that the wheel of retribution was swinging full circle. Many who knew the extent of the horrors perpetrated by the Third Reich were taking no chances. Highly placed bureaucrats and top-ranking Nazi officials had quietly moved their families out of Berlin or were in the process of doing so. Fanatics still remained, and the average Berliners, less privy to information and ignorant of the true situation, were also staying. They could not or would not leave. "Oh, Germany, Germany, my fatherland," wrote Erna Sanger, a 65-year-old housewife and mother of 6 children, in her diary. "Trust brings disappointment. To believe faithfully means to be stupid and blind. But we'll stay in Berlin. If everyone left like the neighbours, the enemy would have what he wants. No, we don't want that kind of defeat." Yet few Berliners could claim to be unaware of the nature of the danger. Almost everyone had heard the stories. One couple, Hugo and Edith Neumann, living in Kreuzberg, actually had been informed by telephone. Some relatives living in the Russian-occupied zone had risked their lives, shortly before all communications ceased, to warn the Neumanns that the conquerors were raping, killing, and looting without restraint. Yet the Neumanns stayed. Hugo's electrical business had been bombed, but to abandon it now was unthinkable. Others chose to dismiss the stories because propaganda, whether spread by refugees or inspired by the government, had little or no meaning for them any longer. From the moment Hitler ordered the unprovoked invasion of Russia in 1941, all Germans had been subjected to a relentless barrage of hate propaganda. The Soviet people were painted as uncivilized and subhuman. When the tide turned and German troops were forced back on all fronts in Russia, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's club-footed propaganda chief, intensified his efforts, particularly in Berlin. Goebbels's assistant, Dr. Werner Naumann, privately admitted that Our propaganda as to what the Russians are like, as to what the population can expect from them in Berlin, has been so successful that we have reduced the Berliners to a state of sheer terror. By the end of 1944, Naumann felt that, "We have overdone it. Our propaganda has ricocheted against us." Now the tone of the propaganda had changed. As Hitler's empire was sheared off piece by piece, as Berlin was demolished block by block, Goebbels had begun to switch from terror-mongering to reassurance. Now the people were told that victory was just around the corner. About all Goebbels succeeded in doing was to generate among cosmopolitan Berliners a grotesque, macabre kind of humour. It took the form of a large, collective raspberry, which the population derisively directed at themselves, their leaders, and the world. Berliners quickly changed Goebbels' motto, "The Führer commands we follow, to the Führer commands we bear what follows." As for the propaganda chief's promises of ultimate victory, the irreverent solemnly urged all to "enjoy the war, the peace will be terrible." In the atmosphere of near panic created by the refugees' reports, facts and reason became distorted as rumour took over. All sorts of atrocity stories spread throughout the city. Russians were described as slant-eyed Mongols who butchered women and children on sight. Clergymen were said to have been burned to death with flamethrowers. The stories told of nuns raped and then forced to walk naked through the streets, of how women were made camp followers, and all males marched off to servitude in Siberia. There was even a radio report that the Russians had nailed victims' tongues to tables. The less impressionable found the tales too fantastic to believe. Others were grimly aware of what was to come. In her private clinic in Schönberg, Dr. Anne-Marie Durand-Weber, a graduate of the University of Chicago and one of Europe's most famous gynecologists, knew the truth. The 55-year-old doctor, well known for her anti-Nazi views, she was the author of many books championing women's rights, equality of the sexes, and birth control, all banned by the Nazis, was urging her patients to leave Berlin. She had examined numerous refugee women and had reached the conclusion that, if anything, the accounts of assault understated the facts. Dr. Durand-Weber intended to remain in Berlin herself, but now she carried a small, fast-acting cyanide capsule everywhere she went. After all her years as a doctor, she was not sure that she would be able to commit suicide. But she kept the pill in her bag, for if the Russians took Berlin, she thought that every female from 8 to 80 could expect to be raped. Dr. Margot Sauerbruch also expected the worst. She worked with her husband, Professor Ferdinand Sauerbruch, Germany's most eminent surgeon, in Berlin's oldest and largest hospital, the Charité, in the Mitte district. Because of its size and location close by the main railway station, the hospital had received the worst of the refugee cases. From her examination of the victims, Dr. Sauerbruch had no illusions about the ferocity of the Red Army when it ran amok. The rapes, she knew for certain, were not propaganda. Margot Sauerbruch was appalled by the number of refugees who had attempted suicide, including scores of women who had not been molested or violated. Terrified by what they had witnessed or heard, many had slashed their wrists. Some had even tried to kill their children. How many had actually succeeded in ending their lives, nobody knew. Dr. Sauerbruch saw only those who had failed. But it seemed clear that a wave of suicides would take place in Berlin if the Russians captured the city. Most other doctors apparently concurred with this view. In Wilmersdorf, surgeon Gunther Lamprecht noted in his diary that the major topic, even among doctors, is the technique of suicide. Conversations of this sort have become unbearable. It was much more than mere conversation. The death plans were already underway. In every district, doctors were besieged by patients and friends seeking information about speedy suicide and begging for poison prescriptions. When physicians refused to help, people turned to their druggists. Caught up in a wave of fear, distraught Berliners by the thousands had decided to die by any means rather than submit to the Red Army. "The first pair of Russian boots I see, I'm going to commit suicide," 20-year-old Christa Munier confided to her friend, Julian Bochnik. Christa had already secured poison. So had Julian's friend Rosie Hoffman and her parents. The Hoffmanns were utterly despondent and expected no mercy from the Russians. Although Julian did not know it at the time, the Hoffmanns were related to Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, head of the Gestapo and the SS, the man responsible for the mass murder of millions in the concentration camps. Poison, particularly cyanide, was the preferred method of self-destruction. One type of capsule, known as a KCB pill, was in especially great demand. This concentrated hydrocyanic compound was so powerful that death was almost instantaneous. Even the fumes could kill. With Germanic forethought, some government agency had laid down vast quantities of it in Berlin. Nazi officials, senior officers, government department heads, and even lesser functionaries were able to get supplies of poison for themselves, their families, and friends with little difficulty. Doctors, druggists, dentists, and laboratory workers also had access to pills or capsules. Some even improved on the tablet's potency. Dr. Rudolf Huckel, professor of pathology at the University of Berlin and the best-known cancer pathologist in the city, had added acetic acid to cyanide capsules for himself and his wife. If they needed them, he assured her, the acetic acid would make the poison work even faster. Some Berliners, unable to get the quick-acting cyanide, were hoarding barbiturates or cyanide derivatives. Comedian Heinz Rühmann, often called the Danny Kaye of Germany, was so fearful of the future for his beautiful actress wife, Hertha Feiler, and their young son, that he had hidden a can of rat poison in a flower pot, just in case. The former Nazi ambassador to Spain, retired Lieutenant General Wilhelm Faupel, planned to poison himself and his wife with an overdose of medicine. The general had a weak heart. When he suffered attacks, he took a stimulant containing digitalis. Faupel knew that an overdose would cause cardiac arrest and end matters quickly. He had even saved enough for some of his friends. For others, a fast bullet seemed the best and bravest end. But an astonishing number of women, mostly middle-aged, had chosen the bloodiest way of all, the razor. In the Ketzler family in Charlottenburg, Gertrude, 42, normally a cheerful woman, now carried a razor blade in her purse, as did her sister and mother-in-law. Gertrude's friend, Inga Ruhling, had a razor blade too, and the two women anxiously discussed which was the most effective way to ensure death, a slash across the wrists or a lengthwise slit up the arteries. There was always the chance that such drastic measures might not have to be taken. For most Berliners, there still remained one last hope. In terror of the Red Army, the vast majority of the population, particularly the women, now desperately wanted the Anglo-American forces to capture Berlin. It was almost noon. Back of the Russian lines, in the city of Bromberg, Captain Sergei Ivanovich Golbov gazed bleary-eyed about the large living room of the luxurious third-floor apartment he and two other Red Army correspondents had just liberated. Golbov and his friends were happily drunk. Every day they drove from the headquarters in Bromberg to the front 90 miles away to get the news, but at the moment everything was quiet. There would not be much to report until the Berlin offensive began. In the meantime, after months of front-line reporting, the good-looking 25-year-old Golbov was enjoying himself. Bottle in hand, he stood looking at the rich furnishings. He had never seen anything quite like them. Heavy paintings in ornate gold frames adorned the walls. The windows had satin-lined drapings. The furniture was upholstered in rich brocaded materials. Thick Turkish carpets covered the floors, and massive chandeliers hung in the living room and the adjoining dining room. Golbov was quite sure that an important Nazi must have owned this apartment. There was a small door ajar at one end of the living room. Golbov pushed it open and discovered a bathroom. At the end of a rope hanging from a hook on the wall was the body of a Nazi official in full uniform. Golbov stared briefly at the body. He had seen thousands of dead Germans, but this hanging body looked silly. Golbov called out to his friends, but they were having too much fun in the dining room to respond. They were throwing German and Venetian crystal at the chandelier, and at each other. Golbov walked back into the living room, intending to sit down on a long sofa he had noticed there, but now he discovered that it was already occupied. Lying on it at full length, in a long Grecian-like gown with a tasselled cord at the waist, was a dead woman. She was quite young, and she had prepared for death carefully. Her hair was braided and hung over each shoulder. Her hands were folded across her breasts. Nursing his bottle, Golbov sat down in an armchair and looked at her. Behind him, the laughter and the smashing of glassware in the dining room continued. The girl was probably in her early 20s, and from the bluish marks on her lips, Golbov thought she had probably taken poison. Back of the sofa on which the dead woman lay was a table with silver-framed photographs, smiling children with a young couple, presumably their parents, and an elderly couple. Golbov thought of his family. During the siege of Leningrad, his mother and father, half-starved, had tried to make a soup out of a kind of industrial oil. It had killed them both. One brother had been killed in the first days of the war. The other, 34-year-old Mikhail, a partisan leader, had been caught by the SS, tied to a stake, and burned alive. This girl lying on the sofa had died quite peacefully, Golbov thought. He took a long swig at the bottle, stepped over to the sofa, and picked up the dead girl. He walked over to the closed windows. Behind him, amid shouts of laughter, the chandelier in the dining room smashed to the ground with a loud crash. Golbov broke quite a lot of glass himself as he threw the dead girl's body straight through the window. I have not seen the Ehrenberg leaflet, but many of those I interviewed did. Furthermore, it is mentioned repeatedly in official German papers, war diaries, and in numerous histories, the most complete version appearing in Admiral Dönitz's memoirs, page 179. That the leaflet existed, I have no doubt, but I question the above version, for German translations from Russian were notoriously inaccurate. Still, Ehrenberg wrote other pamphlets which were as bad as anyone can see from his writings, particularly those officially published in English during the war by the Soviets themselves, in Soviet War News, 1941-45, Vols. 1, 8. His Kill the Germans theme was repeated over and over, and apparently with the full approval of Stalin. On April 14, 1945, in an unprecedented editorial in the Soviet military newspaper Red Star, he was officially reprimanded by the propaganda chief, Alexandrov, who wrote, "Comrade Ehrenberg is exaggerating. We are not fighting against the German people, only against the Hitlers of the world." The reproof would have been disastrous for any other Soviet writer, but not for Ehrenberg. He continued his Kill the Germans propaganda as though nothing had happened, and Stalin closed his eyes to it. In the 5th volume of his memoirs, People, Years and Life, published in Moscow, 1963, Ehrenberg has conveniently forgotten what he wrote during the war. On page 126 he writes, "In scores of essays I emphasized that we must not, indeed we cannot, hunt down the people, that we are, after all, Soviet people and not fascists." But this much has to be said. No matter what Ehrenberg wrote, it was no worse than what was being issued by the Nazi propaganda chief, Goebbels, a fact that many Germans have conveniently forgotten too, who almost daily shook their fists at the bombers, who, as often as not, sorrowed for family, relatives or friends lost in air raids or in the armed forces, now fervently spoke of the British and Americans not as conquerors, but as liberators. It was an extraordinary reversal of attitude, and this state of mind produced curious results. Charlottenburger Maria Koechle refused to believe the Americans and British would let Berlin fall into Russian hands. She was even determined to help the Western Allies. The grey-haired 45-year-old housewife told friends she was ready to go out and fight to hold back the Reds until the armies get here. Many Berliners fought down their fears by listening to BBC broadcasts and noting each phase of the battles being fought on the CR, almost as though they were following the course of a victorious German army rushing to the relief of Berlin. In between raids, Margarete Schwarz, an accountant, spent night after night with her neighbours, meticulously plotting the Anglo-American drive across Western Germany. Each mile gained seemed to her almost like another step toward liberation. It seemed that way to Lieselotte Ravén, too. Her time was spent in her book-lined apartment in Tempelhof, where she carefully penciled in the latest American advances on a big map and feverishly willed the armies on. Frau Ravenna did not like to think of what might happen if the Russians came in first. She was a semi-invalid, with steel braces around her hips and running down her right leg. Thousands were quite certain the armies would get to Berlin first. Their faith was almost childlike, vague and unclear. Frau Anna-Maria Huckel, whose husband was a doctor, began tearing up old Nazi flags to use as bandages for the great battle she was expecting on the day the Americans arrived. Charlottenburger Brigitte Weber, a 20-year-old bride of 3 months, was sure the Americans were coming, and she thought she knew where they intended to live. Brigitte had heard that Americans enjoyed a high standard of living and liked the finer things of life. She was ready to bet they had carefully chosen the wealthy residential district of Nikolassy. Hardly a bomb had fallen there. Others, while hoping for the best, prepared for the worst. Sober-minded Pia van Herven and her friends Ruby and Eberhard Borgmann reluctantly reached the conclusion that only a miracle could keep the Russians from getting to Berlin first. So they jumped at the invitation of their good friend, the jovial, fat-cheeked Heinrich Schell, to join him and his family when the battle for the city began. Schell managed Gruban Souchet, one of the most famous wine shops and restaurants in Berlin, situated on the ground floor below the Borgmanns. He had turned one of his cellars into a resplendent shelter, complete with oriental rugs, draperies, and provisions to withstand the siege. There was little food except for potatoes and canned tuna fish, but there were ample supplies of the rarest and most delicate of German and French wines in the adjacent wine cellar, plus Hennessy cognac and case after case of champagne. "While we wait for God knows what," he told them, "we might as well live comfortably." Then he added, "If we run out of water, there's always the champagne." Biddy Jungmittag, a 41-year-old mother of 2 young daughters, thought that all the talk about the Americans and British coming was, in her own words, just so much tripe. The British-born wife of a German, she knew the Nazis only too well. Her husband, suspected of belonging to a German resistance group, had been executed 5 months before. The Nazis, she thought, would fight as fiercely against the Western Allies as against the Russians, and a glance at the map showed that the odds were against the Anglo-Americans getting to Berlin first. But the Red Army's impending arrival did not unduly alarm Biddy. They would not dare touch her. In her sensible English way, Biddy intended to show the first Russians she met her old British passport. There were some who felt no need for documents to protect them. They not only expected the Russians, but longed to welcome them. That moment would be the fulfillment of a dream for which small groups of Germans had worked and schemed most of their lives. Hunted and harassed at every turn by the Gestapo and the criminal police, a few hardened cells had somehow survived. The German communists and their sympathizers waited eagerly for the saviors from the East. Although totally dedicated to the overthrow of Hitlerism, the communists of Berlin had been so scattered that their effectiveness, to the Western Allies at any rate, was minimal. A loose-knit communist underground did exist, but it took its orders solely from Moscow and worked exclusively as a Soviet espionage network. Hildegard Radusch, who had been a communist deputy to the Berlin House of Assembly from 1927 to 1932, was getting by almost on faith alone. She was half-starved, half-frozen, and in hiding, along with a few other communists near the village of Prieros on the southeastern fringe of Berlin. With her girlfriend Elsa, Eddie Klopsch, she lived in a large wooden machinery crate measuring 10 feet by 8 and set in concrete. It had no gas, electricity, water, or toilet facilities, but to the burly 42-year-old Hildegard, who described herself as the man around the house, it was the perfect refuge. Hildegard and Eddie had lived together since 1939. They had existed underground in Prieros for almost 10 months. Hildegard was on the Nazi wanted list, but she had outwitted the Gestapo again and again. Her greatest problem, like that of the other communists in the area, was food. To apply for ration cards would have meant instant disclosure and arrest. Luckily, Eddie, though a sympathizer, was not wanted as a communist and had weekly rations. But the meagre allowance was hardly enough for one. The official Nazi newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, had printed the week's adult allowance as 4¼ pounds of bread, 2 pounds of meat and sausage, 5 ounces of fat, 5 ounces of sugar, and every 3 weeks 2¼ ounces of cheese and 3½ ounces of ersatz coffee. Occasionally the two women were able to supplement their diet by cautious buying on the black market, but prices were exorbitant. Coffee alone cost from $100 to $200 per pound. Hildegard was preoccupied with two thoughts constantly: food and liberation by the Red Army. But waiting was hard, and simply surviving was growing more difficult month by month, as she methodically recorded in her diary. On February 13th, 1945, she wrote, "It is high time the Russians got here. The dogs haven't got me yet." February 18th. No report since the 7th from Zhukov about the Berlin front, and we are so desperately awaiting their arrival. Come, tovarishti. The quicker you are here, the quicker the war will end. February 24th. To Berlin today. Coffee from thermos, 1 piece of dry bread. 3 men looked at me suspiciously during the trip. So comforting to know that Eddie is beside me. Didn't get anything to eat anywhere. Eddie really took the trip to get cigarettes on the ration card she bought on the black market. 10 cigarettes were due on that. None in the store, so she took 5 cigars. She had hoped to barter a silk dress and 2 pairs of stockings for something edible. Nothing doing. No black market bread either. February 25th. 3 cigars are gone. Still no communiques from Zhukov. None from Koniev either. February 27th. I'm getting nervous from all this waiting. It is catastrophic for someone anxious to work to be cooped up here. March 19th. Wonderful meal at noon, potatoes with salt. In the evening, potato pancakes fried in cod liver oil. Taste isn't so hot. Now, on this first day of spring, Hildegard was still waiting and, her diary noted, almost crazy for something to eat. There were no reports from the Russian front. All she could find to write down was that winds are sweeping winter from field and meadow, snowdrops are blooming, the sun is shining and the air is warm, the usual air raids, judging by the detonations, the planes are coming closer to us. And later, noting that the Western Allies were on the Rhine and could, by her reckoning, be in Berlin in 20 days, she bitterly recorded that Berliners would rather have the men from the capitalistic countries. She hoped that the Russians would arrive quickly, that Zhukov would attack by Easter. About 25 miles due north of Prieros, at Neuenhagen on the eastern fringes of Berlin, another communist cell grimly waited. Its members, too, lived in constant fear of arrest and death, but they were more militant and better organized than their comrades in Prieros, and they were luckier, too. They were barely 35 miles from the Oder, and expected that theirs would be one of the first outlying districts captured. Members of this group had worked night after night under the very noses of the Gestapo, preparing a master plan for the day of liberation. They knew the names and whereabouts of every local Nazi, SS, and Gestapo official. They knew who would cooperate and who would not. Some were marked for immediate arrest, others for liquidation. So well organized was the group that it had even made detailed plans for the future administration of the township. All members of this cell waited anxiously for the Russians to come, sure that their recommendations would be accepted. But none waited more anxiously than Bruno Zarzicki. He suffered so badly from ulcers that he could hardly eat, but he kept saying that the day the Red Army arrived his ulcers would disappear. He knew it. Incredibly, all over Berlin, in tiny cubicles and closets, in damp cellars and airless attics, a few of the most hated and persecuted of all Nazi victims hung grimly to life and waited for the day when they could emerge from hiding. They did not care who arrived first, so long as somebody came, and quickly. Some lived in 2s and 3s, some as families, some even in small colonies. Most of their friends thought them dead, and in a sense they were. Some had not seen the sun in years or walked in a Berlin street. They could not afford to be sick, for that would mean getting a doctor, immediate questions, and possible disclosure. Even during the worst bombings, they stayed in their hiding places, for in air raid shelters they would have been spotted immediately. They preserved an iron calm, for they had learned long ago never to panic. They owed their very lives to their ability to quell nearly every emotion. They were resourceful and tenacious, and, after 6 years of war and nearly 13 years of fear and harassment in the very capital of Hitler's Reich, almost 3,000 of them still survived. That they did was a testimonial to the courage of a large segment of the city's Christians, none of whom were ever to receive adequate recognition of the fact that they protected the despised scapegoats of the new order, the Jews. Siegmund and Margarete Weltlinger, both in their late 50s, were hiding in a small ground-floor apartment in Pankow. A family of Christian Scientists, the Moorings, risking their own lives, had taken them in. It was crowded. The Moorings, their 2 daughters, and the Weltlingers all lived together in a 2-room flat. But the Moorings shared their rations and everything else with the Weltlingers and had never complained. Only once in many months had the Weltlingers dared venture out. An aching tooth prompted them to take the chance, and the dentist who extracted it accepted Margaret's explanation that she was a visiting cousin. They had been lucky up to 1943. Although Siegmund was expelled from the stock exchange in 1938, he was asked soon afterward to take over special tasks with the Jewish Community Bureau in Berlin. In those days, the Bureau, under the leadership of Heinrich Stahl, registered the wealth and properties of Jews. Later it tried to negotiate with the Nazis to alleviate the sufferings of Jews in concentration camps. Stahl and Weltlinger knew that it was only a question of time before the Bureau was closed, but they bravely continued their work. Then, on February 28, 1943, the Gestapo closed down the Bureau. Stahl disappeared into the Theresienstadt concentration camp, and the Weltlingers were ordered to move to a 60-family Jews' house in Reinickendorf. The Weltlingers stayed in the Reinickendorf house until dark. Then they removed the Star of David from their coats and slipped out into the night. Since then, they had lived with the Moorings. For 2 years, the outside world for them had been only a patch of sky framed by buildings, plus a single tree which grew in the dismal courtyard facing the apartment's kitchen window. The tree had become a kind of calendar of their imprisonment. "Twice we've seen our chestnut tree decked out with snow," Margarete told her husband. "Twice the leaves have turned brown, and now it's blooming again." She was in despair. Would they have to spend yet another year in hiding? "Maybe," Margarete told her husband, "God has forsaken us." Siegmund comforted her. They had a lot to live for, he told her. Their 2 children, a daughter 17 and a son 15, were in England. The Weltlingers had not seen them since Siegmund had arranged to get them out of Germany in 1938. Opening a Bible, he turned to the 91st Psalm and slowly read, "1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee." All they could do was to wait. "God is with us," he told his wife. "Believe me, the day of liberation is at hand." In the previous year, more than 4,000 Jews had been arrested by the Gestapo in the streets of Berlin. Many of these Jews had risked detection because they were unable to stand confinement any longer. Hans Rosenthal, 20, was still hiding in Lichtenberg and was determined to hold out. He had spent 26 months in a cubicle barely 6 feet long and 5 feet wide. It was actually a kind of small tool shed attached to the back of a house owned by an old friend of Hans's mother. Rosenthal's existence up to now had been perilous. His parents were dead, and at 16 he was put into a labour camp. In March of 1943 he escaped and, without papers, took a train to Berlin and refuge with his mother's friend. There was no water and no light in his cell-like hiding place, and the only toilet facility available was an old-fashioned chamber pot. He emptied that at night during the air raids, the only time he dared leave his hiding place. Except for a narrow couch, the cubicle was bare. But Hans did have a Bible, a small radio, and, on the wall, a carefully marked map. Much as he hoped for the Western Allies, it seemed to him that the Russians would capture Berlin, and that worried him, even though it would mean his release. But he reassured himself by saying over and over, I am a Jew. I have survived the Nazis, and I'll survive Stalin too. In the same district, in a cellar in Karlshorst, Joachim Lipschitz lived under the protection of Otto Kruger. On the whole, it was quiet in the Kruger cellar, but sometimes Joachim thought he heard the distant boom of Russian guns. The sound was soft and muttering, like a bored audience applauding with gloved hands. He put it down to imagination. The Russians were much too far away. Still, he was familiar with Russian cannonading. The son of a Jewish doctor and a Gentile mother, he had been inducted into the Wehrmacht. In 1941, on the Eastern Front, he had lost an arm on the battlefield, but service to Germany had not saved him from the crime of being a half-Jew. In April 1944, he had been marked for internment in a concentration camp. From that moment on, he had been in hiding. The 27-year-old Joachim wondered what would happen now as the climax approached. Every night, the Krugers' eldest daughter, Eleanor, came down to the basement to discuss the outlook. They had been sweethearts since 1942, and Eleanor, making no secret of their friendship, had been disqualified from attending a university because of her association with an unworthy person. Now they longed for the day when they could marry. Eleanor was convinced that the Nazis were militarily bankrupt and that the collapse would come soon. Joachim believed otherwise. The Germans would fight to the bitter end, and Berlin was sure to become a battlefield, perhaps another Verdun. They also disagreed about who would capture the city. Joachim expected the Russians, while Eleanor anticipated the British and Americans. However, Joachim believed they should be prepared for any eventuality. Consequently, Eleanor was studying English, and Joachim was mastering Russian. None awaited the fall of Berlin with more anguish than Leo Sternfeld, his wife Agnes, and their 23-year-old daughter Anne-Marie. The Sternfelds were not in hiding, as the family was Protestant. However, because Leo's mother was Jewish, he was categorized by the Nazis as a half-Jew. As a result, Leo and his family had lived in torment throughout the war. The Gestapo had tormented them like a cat with a mouse. They were allowed to live where they wished, but always under the threat of arrest. The danger had increased as the war drew nearer, and Leo had struggled to keep the women's spirits up. The night before, a bomb had demolished the nearby post office, but Leo was still able to joke about it. "You won't have to go far for the mail anymore. The post office is lying on the steps." As Leo left their home in Tempelhof on that March morning, he knew he had delayed making his plans too long. They could not leave Berlin, and there was no time to go into hiding. If Berlin was not captured within the next few weeks, they were doomed. Leo had been tipped off that the Gestapo planned to round up all those with even a drop of Jewish blood on May 19th. Far to the west, at the headquarters of the British Second Army in Walbeck, near the Dutch border, Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes, the senior medical officer, tried to anticipate the health problems he might encounter in the coming weeks, especially when they reached Berlin. Secretly, he feared outbreaks of typhus. A few refugees were already passing through the front lines, and his assistants reported that they carried a variety of contagious diseases. Like every other doctor along the Allied front, Brigadier Hughes was watching developments very carefully. A serious epidemic could be disastrous. Tugging at his moustache, he wondered how he would cope with the refugees when the trickle became a flood. There would also be thousands of Allied prisoners of war, and God only knew what they would find when they reached Berlin. The brigadier was also concerned about another related problem, the concentration and labour camps. There had been some information about them via neutral countries, but no one knew how they were run, how many people they contained, or what the conditions were like. Now it seemed that the British Second would be the first army to overrun a concentration camp. On his desk was a report that one lay directly in the path of their advance, in the area north of Hanover. There was almost no further information about it. Brigadier Hughes wondered what they would find, and hoped the Germans had shown their usual thoroughness in medical matters and had the health situation under control. He had never heard of the place before. It was called Belsen. The estimated figure of Jewish survivors comes from Berlin Senate statistics prepared by Dr. Wolfgang Scheffler of Berlin's Free University. They are disputed by some Jewish experts, including Sigmund Weltlinger, chairman for Jewish affairs in the post-war government, who places the number who survived at only 1,400. Besides those underground, Dr. Scheffler states that at least another 5,100 Jews who had married Christians were living in the city under so-called legal conditions. But at best, that was a nightmarish limbo, for those Jews never knew when they would be arrested. Today, 6,000 Jews live in Berlin, a mere fraction of the 160,564 Jewish population of 1933, the year Hitler came to power. Of that figure, no one knows for certain how many Jewish Berliners left the city, emigrated out of Germany, or were deported and exterminated in concentration camps. Captain Helmut Kords, a 25-year-old veteran of the Russian front, was a holder of the Iron Cross for bravery. He was also a prisoner in Berlin and probably would not live to see the end of the war. Captain Kords was a member of an elite group, the small band of survivors from the 7,000 Germans arrested in connection with the attempted assassination of Hitler on July 20, 1944. Hitler had wreaked his vengeance in a barbaric orgy. Almost 5,000 alleged participants had been executed, both innocent and guilty alike. Whole families had been wiped out. Anyone even remotely connected with the plotters had been arrested and, as often as not, summarily executed. They had been put to death in a manner prescribed by Hitler himself. They must all be hanged like cattle, he had ordered. The principals were hanged in exactly that fashion, from meat hooks. Instead of rope, most of them were strung up with piano wire. Now, in Wing B of the star-shaped Lehrterstrasse prison, the last group of the alleged plotters waited. They were both conservatives and communists. They were army officers, doctors, clergymen, university professors, writers, former political figures, ordinary working men, and peasants. Some had no idea why they were imprisoned. They had never been formally charged. A few had been tried and were awaiting retrial. Some had actually been proved innocent but were still being held. Others had been given sham trials, hurriedly sentenced, and were now awaiting execution. No one knew exactly how many prisoners there were in Wing B. Some thought 200, others fewer than 100. There was no way of keeping count. Each day prisoners were taken out, never to be seen again. It all depended on the whims of one man, the Gestapo chief, SS Gruppenführer Heinrich Müller. The incarcerated expected little mercy from him. Even if the Allies were at the very prison gates, they believed Müller would continue the butchery. Kords was one of the innocent. In July 1944, he had been stationed at Bendlerstrasse as a junior officer on the staff of the Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, Colonel Klaus Graf von Stauffenberg. There was, as it turned out, just one thing wrong with that assignment. The distinguished-looking, 36-year-old von Stauffenberg, who had only one arm and wore a black patch over his left eye, was the key figure in the July 20th plot, the man who had volunteered to kill Hitler. At Führer's headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia, during one of Hitler's lengthy military conferences, von Stauffenberg had placed a briefcase containing a time bomb beneath the long map table near where Hitler stood. Minutes after von Stauffenberg had slipped out of the room to start back to Berlin, the bomb exploded. Miraculously, Hitler survived the blast. Hours later in Berlin, von Stauffenberg, without benefit of a formal trial, was shot to death in the courtyard of the Bendlerstrasse headquarters, along with 3 other key military figures in the plot. Everyone even remotely associated with him was arrested, including Helmut Kords. Kords' fiancée, Jutta Sorge, granddaughter of the former German Chancellor and Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann, had also been arrested and imprisoned. So had her mother and father. All of them, including Helmut Kords, had been held without trial ever since. Corporal Herbert Kosny, imprisoned in the same building, knew even less about the July 20th plot than Kords. Kosny had been implicated unwittingly. He was part of a communist resistance group and his participation in the assassination attempt had consisted of transporting an unknown man from Lichterfelde to Wannsee. Although not a communist, Herbert had been on the fringes of various Red Underground groups since 1940. In November 1942, while he was on military leave in Berlin, his elder brother Kurt, a member of the Communist Party since 1931, had violently dissuaded Herbert from returning to the front. He broke Herbert's arm with a rifle, took him to a military hospital, and explained that he had found the injured soldier lying in a ditch. The trick worked. Herbert never returned to the front. He was stationed with a reserve battalion in Berlin, and every 3 months got a new medical certificate from Dr. Albert Olberts, which kept him on light duty. Dr. Olberts happened to be a member of a communist resistance group too. It was Olberts who brought about Herbert's imprisonment. A few days after the attempt on Hitler's life, Olberts told Herbert to come with him on an urgent transportation job. Taking a military ambulance, they picked up a man unknown to Herbert, a senior officer in the Gestapo, General Arthur Neber, chief of the criminal police, who was wanted for questioning. Some time later, Neber was captured, so were Olberts and Herbert. Olberts committed suicide. Neber was executed. Herbert was tried and condemned to death by a civilian court. But because he was still in the army, a retrial by a military court was necessary. Herbert knew it was a mere formality, and formalities meant little to Gestapo Chief Müller. As he looked out his cell window, Herbert Kosny wondered how soon he would be executed. Not far away, another man sat wondering what the future had in store for him, Herbert's brother, Kurt Kosny. He had been interrogated repeatedly by the Gestapo, but had so far told them nothing about his communist activities. Certainly he had not revealed anything to incriminate his younger brother. He worried about Herbert. What had happened to him? Where had he been taken? Only a few cells separated the two brothers, but neither Kurt nor Herbert knew they were in the same prison. Although they were not in jail, another group of prisoners was living in Berlin. They were people who had been rejected from the deportations because they had been hidden or simply missed. All of them lived in fear of being discovered by the Nazis, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Most of these prisoners had managed to obtain false papers. Many had been aided by members of the German resistance or underground organizations. Some were also in hiding with the help of their former Jewish friends and acquaintances. They knew that the few safe houses left were always subject to discovery. Often whole families of hiding Jews were betrayed by their neighbors, for the neighbors were just as frightened as the Jews. In the end, many of these so-called safe houses turned out to be just as dangerous as the streets themselves. While the number of Jews who had been helped or protected in any way by Christian friends in Berlin had not been great, it had been a considerable help to those who had managed to survive. As the war came to a close, the various fates of Berlin's Jewish and non-Jewish residents were becoming increasingly uncertain. With the Allies closing in, the Nazis' efforts to purge the city of its Jewish inhabitants and anyone deemed undesirable had intensified. The terror of arrest, deportation, and execution was a daily reality for many, while the remaining safe houses grew increasingly risky. The situation was dire for those left in Berlin. The city was a shell of its former self, ravaged by continuous bombings and the encroaching Allied forces. For those who remained in hiding, survival often depended on the goodwill of others and the ability to stay one step ahead of the authorities. In the midst of this chaos, there were moments of unexpected bravery and compassion. Individuals and families who had risked everything to protect their Jewish friends and neighbors found themselves grappling with the consequences of their actions. Many of these unsung heroes faced their own dangers, from arrest by the Gestapo to betrayal by fearful neighbors. The story of Berlin in these final days of the war is one of resilience and desperation. For some, it was a matter of waiting for liberation. For others, it was a fight for survival amidst the rubble of a city in ruins. As the Allied forces closed in, the promise of freedom loomed on the horizon, but for many, the hope of survival was overshadowed by the constant threat of death. When the war finally ended, the extent of the suffering and the scale of the loss became apparent. The survivors of Berlin, both Jewish and non-Jewish, were left to rebuild their lives from the ashes of the conflict. The liberation of the city brought both relief and a heavy burden of loss, as the survivors faced the daunting task of reconstructing their shattered world. In the aftermath, the stories of those who endured, those who perished, and those who risked everything to save others became an essential part of history. The legacy of their courage and sacrifice serves as a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure even in the darkest of times. Their fanaticism was so strong that it sometimes seemed to have penetrated the subconscious. Dr. Ferdinand Sauerbruch at Charité Hospital was working on the anesthetized form of a seriously wounded SS man who had just arrived from the Oder front. Suddenly he was momentarily frozen. In the stillness of the operating theatre, from the depths of his anesthesia, the SS man began to speak. Quietly and distinctly he repeated over and over, "Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!" Although these were the real extremists, there were hundreds of thousands of civilians almost as fanatical. Some were walking caricatures of what the free world thought the fanatical Nazi to be. One of them was 47-year-old Gotthard Karl. Although Gotthard was only a minor civil servant, an accountant on temporary service to the Luftwaffe, he wore the dashing blue Air Force uniform with all the pride and arrogance of an ace fighter pilot. As he entered his apartment in the late afternoon, he clicked his heels sharply together, shot his right arm out, and shouted, "Heil Hitler!" This performance had been going on for years. His wife, Gerda, was thoroughly bored with her husband's fanaticism, but was worried and anxious to discuss some sort of plan for their survival. The Russians, she pointed out, were getting very close to Berlin. Gotthard cut her off. "Rumours," he fumed. "Rumours! Deliberately put out by the enemy." In Gotthard's disoriented Nazi world, everything was going along as planned. Hitler's victory was certain. The Russians were not at the gates of Berlin. Then there were the enthusiastic and impressionable, those who had never considered defeat possible, like Erna Schulze. The 41-year-old secretary in the headquarters of the Oberkommando der Kriegsmarine, Navy High Command, had just realized her life's ambition. She had been made an admiral's secretary, and this was her first day on the job. Shell House, where the headquarters was located, had been badly bombed in the previous 48 hours. Still, the dust and wreckage did not bother Erna. Neither was she perturbed by the order that had just reached her desk. It stated that all Geheime Kommandosache, top-secret files, were to be burned. But Erna was saddened on this first day of her new job to be told at closing time that she and the other employees were to take indefinite leave and that their paychecks would be forwarded. Still, Erna remained unshaken. Her faith was so strong that she even refused to believe the official communiques when defeats were reported. Morale was good throughout Berlin, she believed, and it was only a question of time before the Reich triumphed. Even now, as she left the building, Erna was quite certain that within a few days the Navy would call her back. There were others so trusting and so involved with the upper clique of the Nazi hierarchy that they thought little of the war or its consequences. Caught up in the heady atmosphere and glamour of their privileged positions, they felt not only secure, but in their blind devotion to Hitler, totally protected. Such a person was attractive, blue-eyed Katta Reiss-Häusermann. At 213 Kurfürstendamm, the blonde and vivacious 35-year-old Kita was immersed in her work as assistant to Professor Hugo J. Blaschke, the Nazi leader's top dentist. Blaschke, because he had served Hitler and his court since 1934, had been honoured with the military rank of SS Brigadeführer, Brigadier General, and placed in charge of the dental staff of the Berlin SS Medical Center. An ardent Nazi, Blaschke had parlayed his association with Hitler into the largest and most lucrative private practice in Berlin. Now he was preparing to take it a step farther. Unlike Katta, he could clearly see the writing on the wall, and he planned to leave Berlin at the earliest opportunity. If he remained, his SS rank and position might prove embarrassing. Under the Russians, today's prominence might well become tomorrow's liability. Katta was almost completely oblivious of the situation. She was much too busy. From early morning until late at night she was on the move, assisting Blaschke at various clinics and headquarters, or at his private surgery on the Kurfürstendamm. Competent and well-liked, Kater was so completely trusted by the Nazi elite that she had attended nearly all of Hitler's entourage, and once the Führer himself. That occasion had been the highlight of her career. In November 1944, she and Blaschke had been urgently summoned to the Führer's headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. There they had found Hitler in acute pain. His face, particularly the right cheek, was terribly swollen, she later recalled. His teeth were extremely bad. In all, he had 3 bridges. He had only 8 upper teeth of his own, and even these were backed by gold fillings. A bridge completed his upper dental work, and it was held securely in place by the existing teeth. One of them, the wisdom tooth on the right side, was badly infected. Blaschke took one look at the tooth and told Hitler that it had to come out. There was no way he could save it. Blaschke explained that he would need to remove 2 teeth, a false tooth at the rear of the bridge, as well as the infected one next to it. That meant cutting through the porcelain and gold bridge at a point in front of the false tooth, a procedure that called for a considerable amount of drilling and sawing. Then, after making the final extraction at some later date, he would either make an entirely new bridge or re-anchor the old one. Blaschke was nervous about the operation. It was intricate, and there was no telling how Hitler would behave. Complicating matters even further was the Führer's dislike of anesthetics. He told Blaschke that he would accept only the bare minimum. Both Blaschke and Kater knew he would suffer excruciating pain. Furthermore, the operation might last as long as 30 to 45 minutes. But there was nothing they could do about it. Blaschke gave Hitler an injection in the upper jaw, and the operation began. Kater stood by the Führer's side with one hand pulling back his cheek, the other holding a mirror. Swiftly, Blaschke's rasping drill bored into the bridge. Then he changed the bit and began sawing. Hitler sat motionless, as though frozen, she recalled. Finally, Blaschke cleared the tooth and quickly made the extraction. Throughout, Kater said later, Hitler neither moved nor uttered a single word. It was an extraordinary performance. We wondered how he stood the pain. That had been 5 months ago. As yet, nothing had been done about the Führer's dangling bridge. Outside of Hitler's immediate circle, few knew the details of the operation. One of the cardinal rules for those who worked for the Führer was that everything about him, especially his illnesses, remained top secret. Kater was good at keeping secrets. For example, she knew that a special denture was being constructed for the Reich's acknowledged but unwed First Lady. Blaschke intended to fit the gold bridge next time she was in Berlin. Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun, certainly needed it. Finally, Kater knew one of the most closely guarded secrets of all. It was her responsibility to send a complete set of dental tools and supplies wherever the Führer went. Moreover, she was preparing a new bridge with gold crowns for one of Hitler's 4 secretaries, short, stout, 45-year-old Johanna Wolf. Soon, Kater would fit Wolfie's new bridge over in the surgical room of the Reichskanzlei. She had been travelling back and forth between Blaschke's surgery and the Reichskanzlei almost daily for the last 9 weeks. Adolf Hitler had been there since January 16th. The wagon with the 2 horses, Lisa and Hans. Each day now, Pogonowska watched for certain signs that helped keep him from losing heart. Milkman Richard Pogonowska, photographed in 1945. Unless otherwise credited, all photographs are from the author's private collection. Robert and Ingeborg Kolb in 1945, the Kolb's house in Spandau. The war will pass us by, Robert told Ingeborg. The first sign that it would not was when an army field kitchen pulled up in front of their door. Dr. Arthur Leckscheit, evangelical pastor of the gutted Melanchthon church. Eyes filled with tears, he played his farewell. As bombs burst all over Kreuzberg, people sheltering in adjacent shelters heard the organ pealing out the ancient hymn, "From Deepest Need I Cry to Thee," Karl Johann Weiberg. This Swede, who was more German than the Germans, was also an Allied spy. Mother Superior Kunigundes, head of the House Dahlem, the orphanage and maternity home run by the Mission Sisters of the Sacred Heart. How do you tell 60 nuns and lay sisters that they are in danger of being raped? Erna Sanger, Center, with her daughters-in-law and grandchildren in 1945. To believe faithfully means to be stupid and blind. We'll stay in Berlin. If everyone left like the neighbours, the enemy would have what he wants. Julian Bochnik in 1945. The first pair of Russian boots I see, I'm going to commit suicide. A friend confided to her Pia van Hoven, who waited for the end in a resplendent shelter complete with oriental rugs. Hildegard Radusch left, and her friend Elsa Klopsch. Hildegard, a communist, was on the Nazi wanted list and eagerly awaited the arrival of the Red Army. Bruno Zarzicki, second from left, with the Russians who entered his village. He suffered so badly from ulcers he could hardly eat, but the day the Red Army arrived his ulcers would disappear. He knew it. Herbert Kosny, Kurt Kosny. Captain Helmut Kords, who, like Herbert Kosny, awaited execution for his complicity in the July 20th plot against Hitler. Kords, with his fiancée, Jutta Sorge, also imprisoned. Kords was released in the last days of the war and married Jutta. Lehrterstrasse prison. Berlin Senate Archives. Dr. Lutz Heck, the zoo director and a good friend of Hermann Göring, shown in 1945. Walter Wendt, shown here with Dr. Heinroth, who was in charge of the cattle and survived the fighting in and around the zoo. Gustav Riedel, the lion keeper who was forced to kill his animals, but found some of them good eating. Dr. Katharina Heinroth, who was later to become director of the zoo with her pet monkey. Photo by the author. Kate Häusermann today. Kate and Professor Hugo Blaschke operate on propaganda minister Dr. Joseph Goebbels. She knew one of the most closely guarded secrets of all, the whereabouts of Adolf Hitler. As the spring night closed in, the city took on a deserted look. The ruined Colossus of Berlin, ghostly and vulnerable, stretched out in the pale moonlight, offering a clear target for the nighttime enemy. Below ground, Berliners waited for the bombers and wondered who among them would be alive by morning. At 9 p.m. the RAF came back. The sirens wailed for the fourth time in 24 hours, and the 317th attack on the city began. At his military headquarters on the Hohenzollern-Damm, Major General Helmut Rehmann, working steadily at his desk, paid scant attention to the hammering of anti-aircraft fire and the explosion of bombs. He was desperately fighting for time, and there was little of it left. Only 16 days before, the telephone had rung in Rehmann's Dresden home. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's adjutant, was on the line. "The Führer," said Burgdorf, "has appointed you military commander of Dresden." At first, Rehmann could not even reply. The 16th century Saxony capital, with its fairy tale spires, castles, and cobbled streets, had been almost totally destroyed in 3 massive air attacks. Rehmann, heartbroken by the destruction of the lovely old city, lost his temper. "Tell him there's nothing here to defend except rubble," he shouted, and hung up. His angry words were a rash indulgence. An hour later, Burgdorf called again and said, "The Führer has named you commander of Berlin instead." On March 6th, Rehmann assumed command. Within a few hours, he made an appalling discovery. Although Hitler had declared Berlin a Festung, the fortifications existed only in the Führer's imagination. Nothing had been done to prepare the city against attack. There was no plan, no defences, and virtually no troops. Worse, no provision had been made for the civilian population. An evacuation plan for the women, children, and old people simply did not exist. Now, Rehmann was working around the clock, trying feverishly to untangle the situation. His problems were staggering. Where was he to get the troops, guns, ammunition, and equipment to hold the city? Or the engineers, machinery, and materials to build defences? Would he be allowed to evacuate the women, children, and aged? If not, how would he feed and protect them when the siege began? And again his mind returned to the big question. Time. How much time was left? Even securing senior command officers was difficult. Only now, at this late date, had Rehmann been assigned a chief of staff, Colonel Hans Refior. The able Refior had arrived several hours earlier, and he was more startled than Rehmann by the confusion in Berlin. A few days before, in the illustrated magazine Das Reich, Raffior had seen an article which claimed that Berlin was virtually impregnable. He recalled particularly one line: "Hedgehog position Berlin simply bristles with defences. If so, they must be carefully hidden." Raffior had not been able to spot more than a few. In all his years as a professional soldier, the grey-haired 53-year-old Rehmann had never imagined being faced with such a task. Yet he had to find answers for each problem, and quickly. Was it possible to save Berlin? Rehmann was determined to do all he could. There were numerous examples in military history where defeat had seemed inevitable, and yet a victory was achieved. He thought of Vienna, which had been successfully defended against the Turks in 1683, and of General Graf von Gneisenau, Blucher's chief of staff, who defended Kolberg in 1806. True, these were pale comparisons, but perhaps they offered some hope. Yet Rehmann knew that everything would depend on the German armies holding the Oder front and on the general commanding them. The great ones were gone: Rommel, von Rundstedt, von Kluge, von Manstein, the victorious leaders whose names were once household words. They had all disappeared, were all dead, discredited, or forced into retirement. Now, more than ever, the nation and the armies needed a master soldier, another dashing Rommel, another meticulous von Rundstedt. Berlin's safety, and perhaps even the survival of Germany as a nation, would depend on this. But where was that man? March 22nd dawned misty and cold. South of the city, Reichsstrasse 96 stretched away through the dripping pine forests, patches of frost gleaming dimly on the broad asphalt. Early on this chill second day of spring, the road was crowded with traffic that, even for wartime Germany, had an unreal quality. Some of the heavy lorries that came down the road carried bulky filing cabinets, document cases, office equipment, and cartons. Others were piled high with works of art, fine furniture, crated pictures, brasses, ceramics, and statuary. Atop one open truck, a sightless bust of Julius Caesar rocked gently back and forth. Scattered among the trucks were heavy passenger cars of every kind: Hawks, Wanderers, Mercedes limousines. All bore the silvered swastika medallion that marked them as official vehicles of the Nazi Party. And all were travelling along Reichsstrasse 96 in one direction, south. In the cars were the party bureaucrats of the Third Reich, the Golden Pheasants, those privileged to wear the gilded swastika of the Nazi elite. Together with their wives, children, and belongings, the Golden Pheasants were emigrating. Hard-faced and sombre in their brown uniforms, the men gazed fixedly ahead, as though haunted by the possibility that they might be halted and sent back to the one place where they did not want to be, Berlin. Speeding northward on the opposite side of the road came a Wehrmacht staff car, a big Mercedes with the checkerboard, black, red and white metal flag of a Heeresgruppe commander on its left mudguard. Hunched in an ancient sheepskin coat, a muffler at his throat, Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici sat beside his driver and looked out bleakly at the road. He knew this highway, as did all of the Reich's general officers. Heinrici's cousin, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had once caustically called it der Weg zur Ewigkeit, the road to eternity. It had carried many a senior officer to military oblivion, for Reichsstrasse 96 was the direct route to the German General Staff headquarters, 18 miles from Berlin. Outside high-ranking military circles, few Germans knew the location of this headquarters. Not even local inhabitants were aware that, heavily camouflaged and hidden deep in the woods, the military nerve centre of Hitler's Germany lay just outside their 15th-century town of Zossen. Zossen was Heinrici's destination. If the oncoming traffic, with its disquieting evidence of government departments on the move, made any impression on the general, he did not communicate it to his 36-year-old aide, Captain Heinrich von Bieler, sitting in back with Heinrici's Batman, Balzen. There had been little conversation during the long hours of their 500-mile journey. They had left before dawn from northern Hungary, where Heinrici had commanded the 1st Panzer and Hungarian First Armies. They had flown to Bautzen, near the Czech-German border, and from there had continued by car. and now each hour that passed was bringing the 58-year-old Heinrici, one of the Wehrmacht's masters of defence, closer to the greatest test of his 40-year military career. Heinrici would learn the full details of his new post at Zossen, but he knew already that his concern would not be with the Western Allies, but with his old enemies, the Russians. It was a bitter and, for Heinrici, a classic assignment. He was to take command of Army Group Vistula, with orders to hold the Russians on the Oder and save Berlin. Suddenly, an air raid siren blared. Heinrici, startled, swung around to look back at the cluster of half-timbered houses they had just passed. There was no sign of bombing or Allied planes. The wailing continued, the warbling sound fading now in the distance. It was not the sound that had startled him. He was no stranger to bombing attacks. What had surprised him was the realization that this deep inside Germany, even little villages were having air raid alerts. Slowly, Heinrici turned back. Although he had commanded units from the very beginning of the war in 1939, first on the Western Front, then after 1941 in Russia, he had not been in Germany for more than 2 years, and he had little idea of the impact of total war on the home front. He realized that he was a stranger in his own country. He was depressed. He had not expected anything like this. Yet few German generals had experienced more of the war, and conversely, few of such high rank had achieved less prominence. He was no dashing Rommel, lionized by the Germans for his successes, and then honoured by a propaganda-wise Hitler with a field marshal's baton. Outside of battle orders, Heinrici's name had scarcely appeared in print. The fame and glory that every soldier seeks had eluded him, for in his long years as a combat commander on the Eastern Front, he had fought the Russians in a role that by its very nature relegated him to obscurity. His operations had dealt not with the glories of blitzkrieg advance, but with the desperation of grinding retreat. His specialty was defence, and at that he had few peers. A thoughtful, precise strategist, a deceptively mild-mannered commander, Heinrici was nevertheless a tough general of the old aristocratic school, who had long ago learned to hold the line with the minimum of men and at the lowest possible cost. Heinrici, one of his staff officers once remarked, retreats only when the air is turned to lead, and then only after considerable deliberation. In a war that for him had been a slow and painful withdrawal all the way from the Moscow suburbs to the Carpathian Mountains, Heinrici had held out again and again in near-hopeless positions. Stubborn, defiant and demanding, he had grabbed every chance, even when it was just a matter of holding 1 more mile for 1 more hour. He fought with such ferocity that his officers and men proudly nicknamed him Unser Giftswerg, our tough little bastard. Those meeting him for the first time were often nonplussed by the description tough. Short, slightly built, with quiet blue eyes, fair hair and a neat moustache, Heinrici seemed at first glance more schoolmaster than general, and a shabby schoolmaster at that. It was a matter of great concern to his aide, von Bieler, that Heinrici cared little about looking the part of a colonel-general. Von Bieler constantly fretted about Heinrici's appearance, particularly his boots and overcoat. Heinrici hated the highly polished knee-high jackboot so popular with German officers. He preferred ordinary low-cut boots, worn with old-fashioned World War I leather leggings that buckled at the side. As for his overcoats, he had several, but he liked his somewhat ratty sheepskin coat, and despite all of von Bieler's efforts, he refused to part with it. Similarly, Heinrici wore his uniforms until they were threadbare, and as he believed in travelling light, Heinrici rarely had more than 1 uniform with him, the one on his back.